Tempt Me Not, by Patrick Winters. Aaron Goodwin sighed as he grabbed hold of another book and set it on the shelf just above his head. With that, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice had been returned to its home in the Baker Public Library. He pushed the card on, grabbing the next book and enacting the simple process that had become his mantra: grab, lift, set. A simple process, one that any dunderhead could easily complete, but an increasingly dull one nevertheless. Back when Erin had started at the library, he found such a mantra bearable, even noble in some way. In his school years, he had been the type of guy that found more respite in the flipping of book pages than the conversations of those around him. People he couldn't understand, the written word he could. Why go out partying with casual acquaintances that stupidly guzzled alcohol when the real life of the party was to be found at Jay Gatsby's mansion? Why pursue a hopeless romance with any number of girls who had never even acknowledged his existence when he could fight alongside the likes of Achilles and Odysseus for the fair Helen or the battlefields of Troy? Why? Nowadays, with college 2 years behind him and no social life whatsoever to speak of, the real question had become, why not? Books that once sat in his hand had freed him from the inadequacy of his life. The books on the shelves around him were now more like a prison. The binding that bound his life to his own limited story of a young man left in thoughts of woulda, coulda, shoulda. Grab, lift, set. The nobility of it had lost its luster. As he reached the end of a row, he turned the card out into the main aisle. He paused, taking in the sights the library had to offer, such as they were. There was plenty of room for crowds of readers to sit and peruse some pages. But there weren't any such crowds to speak of, nor had there ever been in Erin's time here. Barker was a modest Tennessee town with modest everything else. Today's small sampling of patrons was even sadder than usual. A teen sat at the far right desk, 3 or 4 books set out before him, all unopened. The classic scene of a high school research paper going unwritten. At the table nearest to Erin, a middle-aged woman sat hunched over the tabletop, a romance novel clutched in her hands. She had a sly smile on her face, and her eyes were squinting through her glasses, as if she were trying to peer at the naughty bits of the characters she was reading about. He craned his neck to look towards the checkout desk. Mrs. Hawkins, the silver-haired head librarian, stood at their computer. Her eyes were narrowed as she stared down at the screen, tapping at keys like a chicken pecking the ground for seeds. She wore one of her many nondescript floral dresses that only would have been fashionable in the 60s, if at all. Her personality was as expressive as her wardrobe, so Erin did her best to steer clear of her beyond what their work called for. Erin straightened himself again. He pushed his cart around and into the next aisle, prepared to enact the sacred mantra. Sparing a glance into the opposite aisle, he stopped. There was someone else in the library he hadn't noticed. A young woman was looking over the books. A gorgeous young woman. One that gave a boot to Erin's mantra and made him pause a moment longer to ogle. She was his age. Long dark hair hung around her slender face. Her lips were full and colored a deep purple. Her eyes shadowed alluringly with eyeliner. A black jacket covered her lithe upper body, its fabric glossing in the light as her arm reached up to a shelf. Dark jeans covered her long legs. Functional and fashionable, and it all worked on her. Definitely not the typical Barker youth. She looked dreadfully out of place in the library, like an urban beauty airdropped, albeit unwillingly, into Bumpkinland. She didn't have the slumped look of resignation that goes with living in a town like Barker. At least, not yet. So that and her look made Erin wonder if she was new in town, and he was sure he'd never seen her around town before. He'd have certainly remembered if he had. He realized he was just standing there, staring for far longer than he should have. He began grabbing, lifting, and setting books in their spots once more, but still glanced her way with every other text he situated. God, was she a sight to see. She was the kind of girl he'd die to ask out if he had the nerve. But he didn't have such nerve, and his reader's imagination began to do what its reserved demeanor would never allow. Scenario after hopeless scenario rushed through his head. A dozen rapid-fire daydreams of the young woman played out in his mind. There was the most basic situation. They'd walk past each other, she'd say hello sweetly. He'd return the greeting. That's all. Then there were the more intricate scenarios. the more unlikely but so much more pleasurable indulgences his mind conjured. He would continue shelving books until she came over